the wild, wild West, Orthodox Jewish pioneers in Los Angeles. Thank you to our sponsors, John and Michelle Landra, in memory of Michelle's mother, Mrs. Miriam Moss, and her Shomer Shabn Aliyah. We should be zocher to see Tchias HaMesim. I have two announcements to make, or two housekeeping announcements, I should say, before we begin. The first is that the battle with any such lecture is how much to leave out. And I know there's going to be a lot of people who are going to come up to me afterwards and say, you didn't mention this, or you could have mentioned that, or there's something I know about it, and it could be that I know it or I don't know it. In the end, any lecture which includes so much material, it's a very broad topic, I'm going to have to leave some material out if I know it. If I don't know it, obviously I've left it out. But broadly speaking, I've created a narrative from the beginning of the lecture, more or less till the end. There's something at the end which is a bit of a surprise. So forgive me if there are names of people who you feel ought to have been mentioned, who I didn't mention. Perhaps on a future occasion, we'll come back to this topic and I will mention them. That's the first thing. The second thing is I'd like to thank all of those who are here and those who are not here, who were enormously helpful to me in compiling the material which I put together for this lecture. What I discovered, and perhaps it's not a surprise to any of you, or perhaps it is that there's actually no proper research on this topic. It's never been done before. And the reason, I can't say what the reason is, the reason that I feel it's happened is because the Los Angeles community has shifted somewhat in quite rapid movements from one area to another area. People have come, people have gone. It's quite a transient community in a sense. And there's no formal history of the Orthodox Jewish pioneers. There was, and I'm going to mention it in a moment, a wonderful exhibition at the AJU of Rabbi Neches last year for 3 months. And they discovered a lot of material that had never been discovered before. But that's just Rabbi Neches. There's a lot of other stuff to be covered. And there's a book here waiting to be written. Don't all look at me. Maybe I will get round to writing it one day. I certainly am going to turn some of the material you'll hear tonight into articles, which hopefully you'll read over the next few months. But let me begin. I'm going to begin with the story about Rabbi Osher Zilberstein. You know he's one of my favorites. Rabbi Osher Zilberstein, he's up there on the screen. The great rabbi from Prague, came to Metz, ended up in Hamburg, and most notably, at least from my writings, he had this almighty battle with Rabbi Yaakov Emden over the Kameas, which were purported to contain references to Shabtai Tzvi. But I'm not going to talk about any of that tonight. I'm going to talk about something else. The only halachic work that he published in his lifetime, and by the way, he was a prolific writer, and if he didn't write material, he had so many students that they wrote a lot of material and published it after he died. And in fact, some people say that Rabbi Osher Zilberstein is still writing because almost every year they come out at least with something from Rabbi Osher Zilberstein. But in his lifetime, he only published one work a year before he died. It's called Kreti Upleti. It's on a section of Shulchan Aruch called Yoredea. And it's an extremely deep and profound work. It contains halachic insights through pilpul and other methods. It's a fantastic work. And I have to tell you that one of the most important halachot, and it really affects us today by omission, regarding the consumption of kosher beef, is that we cannot eat the hindquarters. Are you familiar with that? We're not allowed to eat the hindquarters of beef. That means we only eat the front section of the cow, no rump steak for any kosher eaters. But it wasn't always the case. And there was a very long period of time, until about 150 years ago, maybe 100 years ago, where it was absolutely the norm to consume hindquarter meat. And the way you did it was you cut out that bit which you're not allowed to have, the sciatic nerve. It's called the Gid HaNasheh. It comes from the story of Jacob. Jacob got into a fight with the Sar Shel Esav, the guardian of Esav, on that night before he met Esav, and somehow got damaged in the Gid HaNasheh, as a result of which we're not permitted to eat the Gid HaNasheh for all time, and it has to be apparently the verb for it is to porge. There are porgers, porging the meat. You remove these particular sinews, whatever they are, from the meat. Anyway, this is the story. You're waiting for the story. I bet you're wondering what this has got to do with the pioneers of Orthodoxy in Los Angeles. Okay, here goes. One day, a Porger, an itinerant Porger, Talmud Chacham, arrives in Prague. And he is obviously very knowledgeable about his trade. And he goes to one of the slaughtering houses and he says to the porgers in the slaughtering house, which sinew, which piece of the hindquarters do you remove? So they show him, and he says, no, that's the wrong one. You mustn't take that one out. You have to take another one out. If you take that one out and you leave the other one in, then everybody who eats those hindquarters is eating treif. Are you crazy? We've been doing this for years. How can you say it's treif? And they run to Rabbi Eybeschutz, who's the Dayan on the Prague Beit Din, and they tell him, and he's the big expert, right? They tell him that this Porger has come into town and he's told us that we're doing something wrong. Well, Rabbi Yonasan went to speak to the visitor, and he says to him, tell me, which sinew, which piece of the hindquarters do you take out? Which tendon are you removing that you believe is the Gid HaNasheh? And the man showed him, whereupon Rabbi Yonasan said, and by the way, he writes this in Kretio Plati, that's how we know. He said, he showed the Porger a smug. Smug is a sefer. It's Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, which proved that he was wrong. How did he prove that he was wrong? Because the tendon that this particular person, this Porger, was saying needed to be removed, only apparently is found in male cows, not in female cows. And the smug says that the Gid HaNasheh law is practiced with males and females. Therefore, you must be wrong, Mr. Porger, get out of town. That's the story that he brings down in the Kreti Upleti. Well, very interesting. It's a very interesting story because it demonstrates, doesn't it, how sharp this rabbi was, confronted with a difficult situation and with a revolution on his hands from people who enjoy eating a good steak. He immediately came up with a solution without using Google. How remarkable is that? It would be remarkable if it wouldn't be for the fact that there was a man called Rabbi Cheskel Feivel, the Maggid of Vilna. Now, the Maggid of Vilna was, as it turns out, a plagiarist. He published a couple of books called Toldot Adam, and he published his second volume of Toldot Adam in 1809, which is about 50 years after Rabbi Eybeschutz died. And the book was officially about a man called Reb Zalmela. Reb Zalmela was the brother of Reb Chaim of Volozhin, and Reb Zalmela was apparently the favorite student of the Vilna Gaon. And in Toldot Adam, Rabbi Cheskel Feivel points out that even the greatest rabbis make mistakes. And he points out a few examples, and the primary example that he uses is this story. He said, because, and this is the quote, I looked everywhere in the smug, and even in Semak, which is another acronym, Sefer Mitzvot Katan, and maybe I thought it was a scribal error where he should have written a gimel. He wrote a kuf or a gimel. I'm not sure which one it is. And the reference to males and females could not be found. However, he looked at the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch lists all the mitzvot in the Torah. And it goes according to the Torah order. And he goes to, if you go to Parshat Vayishlach, where the story of the Gid HaNasheh is, then you find there that there is a reference to males and females. But the reference to males and females is not to cows, it's to people. That means the prohibition of not eating hindquarter meat applies to men and women, not to male cows and female cows. You see, Rabbi Eybeschutz made a terrible mistake. He thought he was Google. Google's better. I mean, I'm not sure Rabbi Cheskel Feivel wrote that in Toldot Adam in 1809, but you get the point. And you guess what? The maskilim of the era said, you see, even the rabbis admit that they make mistakes. And it began to become a great source of problem for the rabbinic authorities in Middle Europe. Well, there was a man in 1908, so it's about 100 years later, called, this story, by the way, is going somewhere, I promise you. In 1908, a man called Reb Chaim Dov Gross wrote a book, and he suggested that the abbreviation Samag was actually a scribal error. our printer's mistake or something like that, and it should have been Samach Hey Nun. Don't ask me how you get from Samach Mem Gimel to Samach Hey Nun, but that's what he said. And what does that stand for? Seder HaNikur, maybe? And the reason he said that was because he was working backwards. He made his thesis because he found a reference to male cows and female cows in Sefer HaNikur. You know what Rabbi Yonason did? He went to the Porger, he took the Sefer HaNikur, which is an edition of the Tur, and there it says only male cows have this gid, not the female cows. And somehow when the printer put the book together in 1763, they didn't do it correctly, and maybe he didn't check it correctly, and that's how the mistake crept in. And people were quite skeptical about this because there is quite a difference between Samach Hey Nun and Samach Mem Gimel. They were skeptical until in 1930, which is 167 years after this story was first published, an unknown rabbi from Los Angeles solved the puzzle. And his name was Rabbi Solomon Neches. Rabbi Solomon Neches wrote an article for a periodical in Jerusalem called Sharei Tzion. It's a rabbinical journal, and he wrote as follows: I've got it up there, I think. I have found the solution to the riddle. I have the original volume, Kreti or Pleti, which Rav Yonason Zichrono Livracha printed in his lifetime, and it has several notes in his own handwriting. And in this location, the halachot of Gid HaNashe, next to the word, so I showed him the smug, the Rabbi Zichrono Livracha crossed out the word smug and replaced it with Samach Hey Nun, which is the acronym for Seder Hilchot Nikur. And indeed, in that book, we do find that Gid HaNashe is practiced with male and female animals. This removes the claim of all those who jumped on Rav Yonason, saying that he made this egregious mistake. The honor of the great genius, Rav Yonason, is restored, and it is a mitzvah to publicize this. The article, I have to tell you, I know not a lot of you read rabbinic journals, but I have to tell you that in 1930, this article was an absolute sensation. It was a bombshell. I mean, can you imagine clearing the name of Rabbi Yonason Eybeschutz for every rabbi in the world to read? It was such a bombshell. It was republished in other journals, particularly here in America, in Hapardes. And Rabbi Neches shot from no name to huge fame. He became one of, at least for that period of time, one of the most famous rabbis in America. Well, I read this story many years ago. I didn't know anything about Rabbi Neches. I'm only interested in Rabbi Yonason Eybeschutz. That's how I began. And I read this, an excellent article about this by my dear friend, mentor, Professor Rabbi Schneur Lyman. He wrote an article about Rabbi Yonason and the Porger, and that was published in 2004. I've had discussions with him about it, and the story never made any sense to me. I mean, I'm a book collector. Where would a young rabbi in Los Angeles obtain? Los Angeles wasn't Los Angeles like today. There was very little Jewish life here. Where would he obtain Rabbi Yonason Eibeschutz's Crazy or Placey? Why would it be here? I understand if the guy lived somewhere in Europe and it turned up. In Los Angeles, where would you have got it from? I just said the whole thing didn't make sense to me. Anyway, as I said, last year from July to September, the AJU ran this exhibition about Rabbi Neches, and they displayed this copy of Crazy or Placey, which is now in the collection of the UCLA library. And it's a true story. So you see there, that is a first edition Crazy or Placey. I have a similar one upstairs. And that's the marginal note there. Can you see that? That's the marginal note. And it did belong to Rabbi Yonason Eybeschutz. A different Rabbi Yonason Eybeschutz. Not the same one. In fact, Rabbi Yonason Eybeschutz, who was still alive at the time the article was written. He was Rabbi Yonason Halevi Eybeschutz, a Dayan in Poland. So what Rabbi Neches had done, actually, is make a true claim without giving all the details and facts, and had projected himself onto the international rabbinic scene, claiming back the reputation of Rabbi Yonason Eybeschutz, but the whole thing was based on a note in the margin written by Rabbi Yonasan Halevi Eybeschutz, taken from the article written by Rabbi Gross in 1908. So if you want to be charitable, you could say that Rabbi Neches thought that he was his descendant, and maybe that gave him a little license, but maybe it was originally Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschutz's crazy placey. I don't know. I couldn't ask Rabbi Neches. He died in 1954. I certainly know that Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschtutz probably didn't make an egregious error, and seeing that as that's our principle, I would like to assume that neither did Rabbi Neches. I'm not going to put him quite in the same, chapter as Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschtutz, but let's hope that Rabbi Neches did it for the right reasons. But I'd like to ask you, not about the crazy or placey and how that ended up in Los Angeles. I'd like to ask you who Rabbi Neches was and how he ended up in Los Angeles. So he was born in Jerusalem in 1891. His parents were Yitzchak, was his father, Goldie was his mother, and they were descended from the Vilna Gaon. So they came together with the group that the Vilna Gaon sent to Palestine, Ottoman Palestine, in the early part of the 19th century. And they later lived in New York. I have a feeling that once Rabbi Neches was in America, his parents followed, and he predeceased them. They died after him. This is their graves in New York. They're buried in Queens. Rabbi Neches studied under a man called Rabbi Yosef Eisenbach at the Chaya Olam Yeshiva in Jerusalem, and he was from the renowned Hungarian Eisenbach family. They're still around in Jerusalem. If you go to Meir Sharim or Geula, you'll see Eisenbach. The name Eisenbach is very prominent. Their sons Hasidim. And he had another Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Strasberg, who was a Hasidic Dayan from Kosovo. He came to Jerusalem in 1896. He was 75 years old. He came to die. He lived another, I think, 15 or 20 years. And he wrote a book called Yad Yosef, which was very popular at the time, not so used today. He studied for the rabbinate at the yeshiva called Eitz Chaim. It was run by a grandson of Rabbi Shmuel Salant, who himself became extremely famous, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukachinsky, most famous for having helped to define the international date line during the Second World War. And then Rabbi Neches got smicha from Rav Kook. Here's a picture of Rav Kook from 1919 in London, but this was 10 or so years earlier. He got... It was, 8 years earlier, he got smicha from Rav Kook, and in fact, Rav Kook wrote approbations, letters of recommendation for him, which appear in some of his publications. So he was obviously a serious scholar, but you know what? There weren't a lot of jobs for young rabbis in Palestine in the early 1900s. So his father, so he says in one of his articles, his father encouraged him to travel to the United States to find a job. And he did so. He went to Cairo. He spent a little time in Cairo. And he ended up in New York. And he realized when he got there that he needed to get another smicha, an American smicha. So he went to Rabbi Avraham Aaron Yudelevich, who was a little controversial, but not yet. Rabbi Avraham Aaron Yudelevich was a Lithuanian rabbi who had been in Manchester, England. He'd been in Boston. Then he was in New York. He died in 1930, a very significant Talmud Chacham, hugely respected in the rabbinic world, particularly in America. And he got smicha from him, and then he decided, I think that if I'm living in America, I should learn English. So he went to the Iran Preparatory School, which if you know anything about your immigrant history in New York, you'll know there was this chap called Joseph Iran who set up this school, which was specifically for immigrants. He himself came from an immigrant family, to teach immigrants from Eastern Europe how to speak English, or their version of English, or Yinglish. And 25,000 immigrants went through his school for the several decades that it was open. The moment he died in 1938, it more or less collapsed. He was a remarkable man, and the reason he did it was so that they could go to night school, and they could go to college, and get a proper education and get themselves out of the slum jobs that they were confined to because they couldn't speak English. Well, Rabbi Neches learnt to speak English, or so he thought. His English wasn't very good, and he got a job offer in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And he went to the bus station, and he said, "I'd like a ticket to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania." Well, that's what he thought he said, but they heard him say Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm not doing the Russian accent thing now, but I think you can work it out. Anyway, he got to Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. Now, Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania is 260 miles west of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. It's a long walk. And in addition to that, it's a place which is full of very devout Protestant Christians who hate Catholics, and it would seem Jews as well, because there was no Jews in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. It's on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, and it set itself up as its own city so that it wouldn't have to have anything to do with Catholics who lived in Pittsburgh. Anyway, he finds himself in this place, he doesn't know what to do, and he goes to Pittsburgh, and he's verschlepped, and I guess he's walking with his bags on the street, or he goes into shul, and the reverend, the minister at the shul, takes pity on him, and he says to him, his name was Israel Goodstein. He takes pity on him, and he says to him, "You want to come home with me for dinner?" And he says, "Okay." He goes home, he met his daughter, and they got married. I told Rabbi Neches' grandson that story last week. He'd never heard it before. That's how random this story is. Anyway, from there, having met Rabbi Israel Goodstein, and now Rabbi Goodstein's got his back because his son-in-law, they found him a job in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He became the rabbi of Agudas Achim. First, he became the rabbi of Bnei Israel in Pittsburgh, and eventually he became the rabbi in Agudas Achim in Columbus, Ohio, which is a very significant shul to this day. It's where the Schottenstein family prayed, and the Jerome Schottenstein, the grandfather, not the eventual Jerome Schottenstein, was the vice president of that shul, and it was a wealthy shul. And in 1916, he was still in Pittsburgh. He published his first book, Shemen Turak. It has an approbation from Rav Kook. He wrote hundreds of articles. He may not have been proficient in English in 1913, but by the time he got to 1960, 1980, 1920, he was a fluent English speaker and writer. He published more than 20 books in his lifetime, and he had many more written that he never got to publish. I have seen there's a private library here in Los Angeles. The owner doesn't want me to publicize his name, but he at one stage obtained all the writings of Rabbi Neches, literally dozens of volumes, handwritten volumes. His specialty was Pirkei Avot. He loved writing about Pirkei Avot. He used to collect all the different perushim on Pirkei Avot, and he would publish them. And in the end, he wanted to write an index to Pirkei Avot, and he wrote it, but he never published it. In 1921, Rabbi Neches was invited to become the rabbi of Olive Street Synagogue, which is Beth Israel, in Boyle Heights, which is east of downtown LA. Okay, so we've got to Boyle Heights. It was a long route. What time is it? It was half an hour. But we got to Los Angeles in the end. He came to Boyle Heights, and in the 1920s, Boyle Heights was home to some 50,000+ Jews, most of them Eastern European or Middle European immigrants. And I have to say that Olive Street Synagogue, you've seen the picture up there, was a decent-sized shul, but the biggest shul in Boyle Heights, built in 1922, was the Talmud Torah congregation on Breed Street. It became known as Breed Street Shul. Breed Street Shul started actually in 1904, and it was Congregation Talmud Torah because it was based around a Hebrew school, which was an after-school Hebrew school for local Jewish children. Rudimentary Hebrew and Jewish religious studies taught to children who went to public school for an hour or two every day, and it was centered in that shul, and it became known as the Talmud Torah congregation. The new building opened in 1923, and it was apparently the biggest shul this side of Chicago, west of Chicago, in the United States. A very, very large place. You can still go and see it today. By appointment, you could even get inside. It's a long story. If you want to Google it, you can. But in 1998, Hillary Clinton advocated that it shouldn't be knocked down and that it should be preserved as a site of national heritage. And because of that, it has remained empty and more or less derelict for all that time. I think some parts of it are used as a community center for the Hispanic community in Boyle Heights, but essentially it is a useless large building. But at that time, it was a flourishing congregation. And it remained active until the 1980s, although it only really thrived until sometime during the 1950s, as we'll see, by which time the Jewish community had more or less all moved west. At its height in the 1930s and 1940s, it served 2,000 or more families, which is, you do the math, it's more than 5,000 people, a huge number, really the biggest Orthodox congregation in that part of Los Angeles. The original Jewish community of Los Angeles had started downtown, but then Boyle Heights became the center of Jewish life. Now, in 1925, they turned to Rabbi Neches. They realized they really need a proper rabbi. I don't think they had a proper rabbi until then. They had certain rabbinic people who were supervising the stuff at the shul, but they needed a proper, significant rabbi, and they heard how successfully he had opened and run schools in Columbus, and they really wanted somebody who could upgrade their Talmud Torah and upgrade their image in Los Angeles and beyond. And for the next 10 years, Rabbi Neches was the rabbi of Breed Street Shul, and it made him the most influential Orthodox rabbi in Los Angeles. That means in that period, and all the way through until the death of the second rabbi, the rabbi of Breed Street Shul was considered, in Hebrew you say the Rosh HaRabbonim, maybe in English you say chief rabbi of the Orthodox Jewish rabbinate in Los Angeles. Rabbi Neches held that position first. And he found a kindred spirit in another local rabbi called Rabbi Henoch Singer, and together they tackled the biggest problem. What's the biggest problem that faces a Jewish community which is struggling economically and at the same time struggling to stay true to its Orthodox values and ideals? Kosher meat. You're going to see that's going to be a bit of a theme, okay? Kosher meat was a massive problem. They struggled to maintain kashrus standards, and in the United States, this struggle often turned into war, and in fact, in several communities, into violence. The kind of Jews who moved to America in the early 20th century were not high-caliber scholars. Neither were they very religious. If you were very religious, if that was high on your list of priorities, you didn't tend to move from Europe to the United States. And if you did, you tended not to move quite as far west as Los Angeles. So the Los Angeles Jewish community was not well served by its religious functionaries. And of course, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And let me tell you, there were a lot of blind people in Los Angeles, and there were a lot of unscrupulous one-eyed kings. And they looked to make money of people's ignorance and or indifference. And Rabbi Neches resolved to tackle the problem of kosher butchers selling treif meat, that means not even bothering to go through shchita, by using a law. As in New York in 1922, there was a kosher bill that was put together in New York, a state law. You cannot have it as a federal law for some reason. It's a state law. And a number of other states followed. And Rabbi Neches used his charm and his contacts. He must have been a very charming individual. He was apparently a brilliant speaker and very humorous. And he could speak, obviously, several languages. You know, I once heard this great thing about Nachum Sokolov. Nachum Sokolov was one of the founding fathers of Zionism and a very, very powerful speaker. And they used to say that he could speak 15 languages, all of them in Yiddish. I never heard Rabbi Neches speak, but I probably think the same thing could apply to him. Anyway, he began to expose kosher, so-called kosher butchers who were selling non-kosher meat. And he published the lists on posters and in pamphlets that he gave out. This is the very first one that he gave out, where he lists, and I don't know what the laws of slander or libel were in those days. He published the list week after week after week. They came out in these publications. And at the same time he was fighting, it was a long process, lobbying support for the kosher bill, and it was bitterly opposed by a reform rabbi called, with a rather strange name actually, Rabbi Rudolph Coffey. Rabbi Coffey was an outspoken liberal reform rabbi who lived in Oakland, California. He was also the chaplain at Alcatraz and St. Quentin's. And he always lobbied for every liberal cause out there. In those days, it was different than it is nowadays. But anarchist bombers and all the kinds of things that you can imagine. But the moment he heard that Jews were looking for support because they wanted to make sure they were buying kosher meat, he became the most vigorous opponent of this kosher bill. And he wrote to the state senator, E.H. Christian, and we have the slide here. I'm unalterably opposed to this bill because Judaism need not call upon the state to settle its own internal affairs. We are starting a dangerous precedent in California which can only lead to evil consequences. New York State has this kosher law, and yet it did not prevent the terrible scandal which was uncovered last month in New York City. Use your best influence to prevent it. If Judaism has not enough inner resources to meet present-day conditions, and wait for this, the sooner it passes away, the better. Wow. Anyway, he lost his job in 1931, and he wasn't, I have to tell you, he wasn't a rabbi for much longer. I don't know what happened to him afterwards. I did search for him on the internet, and I couldn't find any trace of him. I'm sure that's a good thing. But Rabbi Neches found support among his own colleagues. Rabbi Singer, his good friend, signed a letter to the state senate together with Rabbi Berman. He also found support from conservative communities. In those days, the conservative Jewish communities, even though they were slightly more lax in their halacha observance, they still wanted to eat kosher meat. Rabbi Eugene Rosenberg of Hollywood Temple Bethel. Do you know anything about Rabbi Rosenberg? You ever heard of him? Rabbi Rosenberg was later employed at Adat Ariel in North Hollywood, but they fired him when they found out he'd married a Christian. Another supporter of the bill wrote, I did say Wild Wild West. I did warn you in advance. Another supporter of the bill wrote a letter was the rabbi of West Adams Hebrew congregation, Rabbi Nathan Adelson. Now, you may not know about West Adams Hebrew congregation. He was conservative, but that congregation later changed its name. In 1938, became Orthodox, and it called itself Beth Jacob. And that same Beth Jacob moved from West Adams under the leadership of Rabbi Dolgin and is now located here in Beverly Hills. He was also supported by Rabbi Rudolph Lupo of the Hollywood Jewish Center. Very well located shul, it would seem, because Rabbi Lupo later got a credit as the rabbinic advisor for the Ten Commandments. It's a lucrative position. The California Kosher Bill was voted into law in 1931. We have a handout. You can take it with you. Where's Ailey? You want to give them out? You're going to see it. I'm not going to read through the whole thing for you because then we'll be here all night. But essentially, it enshrined in law that no one is allowed to sell anything under the label kosher if it's not kosher, according to the standards defined by rabbis. That law is still on the books. This is a version from 2016. It's a law with no teeth, as we're going to learn. Yes, it's got some teeth. You couldn't sell pork because of that law. But it'd be very hard to find any meat which hasn't got a rabbi. Let's say Rabbi Coffey might give his imprimatur to a butcher shop and say that meat is kosher, and then it would be fine according to the kosher law. But for years it did work, and people did use rabbinic supervision to make sure that they were selling kosher meat. We'll get to that soon. CA Penal Code 383B. Just remember that number in case you want to know if the meat you're buying at your local market is kosher. Anyway, Rabbi Neches, having achieved this great objective, became exceptionally bored with being a pastoral rabbi who had to say good Shabbos to people. It wasn't his thing. He was an academic, he was a writer, he was a teacher. He wanted to teach. He didn't want to deal with people and go to visit sick people in hospital. In any event, Boyle Heights was full of schnorrers. He didn't want to deal with schnorrers. He wants to deal with wealthy people. He wanted to deal with people who could fund his publications and fund his teaching. And therefore, he decided, he'd been running classes. I think we have a photograph of him with a class, a photo from 1931 from the Talmud Torah, the graduating class. But he wanted to run with that ball, but not in Boyle Heights. The more affluent Jews had moved to the west side of Los Angeles, to West Adams, to Beverly Fairfax, and even further west. And with the support of various wealthy patrons, he announced the launch of the Western Jewish Institute in 1932. Its initial location was 268 South Serrano Avenue, just north of 3rd. It's north of Koreatown. It's east of central LA, so it's already halfway between Boyle Heights and Fairfax. And the purpose, he said, was to upgrade the level of education, Jewish education for adults and children in the community, and classes began in August 1933. And the first president of the Western Jewish Institute was a man called Samuel Reichler. He was the son of a Polish rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Reichler, and his brother-in-law was an extremely prominent rabbi, one of the most prominent rabbis in America in those days, a man called Rabbi Wolf Zev Gold, who was the principal spokesman representative of Mizrahi in America. He was very briefly a rabbi in San Francisco. He was mainly in New York. He went on Aliyah before the Second World War, and he was the brother-in-law of the president of this Western Jewish Institute. They purchased a site in the Beverly Fairfax area. See if any of you recognize this address, 7269 Beverly Boulevard. It is still there. It is still there. It changed its name to Sharei Tefillah. And Rabbi Neches, that's why now you know why Rabbi Neches, who did or didn't discover this little marginal note from Rabbi Eybeschutz, is such a significant person for the Jewish community of Los Angeles. The original building, we have a picture of it, was deemed unfit, and a new building was proposed in its place. Funders, certificates for donors were handed out. If you gave money, you got a certificate in return. And Rabbi Neches began teaching classes. He focused on adults. He focused on kids. He taught classes for teachers. Here's a photo of the very first teachers class that graduated from the Western Jewish Institute. He began to upgrade the level of Jewish education in Los Angeles, which was a total wilderness in terms of Jewish education. And with his focus on the Western Jewish Institute on the west side of LA, Rabbi Neches and Breed Street Shul parted company around 1934. I'm guessing it was by mutual agreement. And Rabbi Neches moved to the Fairfax area where he lived with Tilly, his wife, and his 3 children. Tilly died in 1948. He did remarry briefly to Greta Stolper in 1949. But in 1950, he retired for what they referred to as health reasons from the Western Jewish Institute. And he lived the last few years of his life in complete obscurity. The place which was the Western Jewish Institute was renamed Sharei Tefillah, and his memory was more or less erased from its history. I think it is mentioned there now on the website, but there's a plaque in the shul, that's right, but you wouldn't know much about him if you went there 20, 30, 40 years ago. He wasn't mentioned. Without him, that place wouldn't have existed. But anyway, let's go back to Boyle Heights, because in 1934-35, Boyle Heights was still a very busy Jewish area. Breed Street Shul, still the most important shul in Los Angeles, right? They need a rabbi. And they began the search for a new rabbi in 1934. 1935, they hired a Russian-born rabbi, Rabbi Osher Zilberstein. He was the rabbi in Winnipeg, in Canada. But for the next 38 years, he lived in Boyle Heights. He died in 1973, and he was the senior rabbi in Los Angeles. This is what he looked like. He was born in Mezrich. He's descended from the Stalin-Karlin Hasidic dynasty, and he married a lady called Chana Rochel Twersky. She's from the Malin Radam Mishel dynasty. Chana Rochel's family was in fact descended from the Baal Shem Tov, founders of the Hasidic movement, and Reb Motel Chernobyl, another very significant Hasidic master. They were the royalty of the Hasidic world. Chana Rochel's grandfather was Reb Gedalia, the Rebbe of Malin, and her father was Avraham Yeshua Heschel Twersky. I don't have a photograph of him. He became the Nadwana Rebbe when his father died in 1901, and he lived in Radam Mishel, which turned out not to be such a good idea, because in 1919, Chana Rochel's father was murdered together with her brother, Reb Mordechai Twersky, in a pogrom. And listen to this number. This is just so shocking. 720 Jews were murdered in Radomyśl in 1919 by Russian militia. It was during the Civil War. Collateral damage. That's what the Jews were, collateral damage. They would come into the town, rape, pillage, kill with impunity. And he was killed. And the entire family, as you can imagine, was terribly affected by this tragedy. And they made efforts to move to the United States of America. And her brother, Reb Henoch, went to Chicago, where he was the Nadwana Rebbe of Chicago. Rabbi Zilberstein moved from Mezrich. He went to Kiev. There was unbelievable anti-Semitism in those days in Kiev, and communist hostility and persecution to anything Jewish. And he decided, it was too much, he decided he wanted to also go to the United States to join his brother-in-law, but he couldn't get a visa. So he did the next best thing, he went to Canada. And he became a rabbi in Winnipeg in Canada. But sadly, in 1929, Chana Rochel died. There was some tragic accident, I couldn't find out what it was. And she's buried in Winnipeg. This is her gravestone. And in 1931, Rabbi Zilberstein went to, he was one of two representatives from North America at the Zionist Congress in Basel, and he decided he needed to remarry. So he went to Poland. A lot more girls in Poland than there were in Basel, it seems. Go figure. And he found Riva. Riva was much younger than him, 23 years younger than him. She lived till she was almost 100 years old. The Rebbetzin, a lot of people knew her. I've spoken to quite a number of people who remember her. Riva Zilberstein, she outlived her husband by many, many years. And she became his saving grace. She came back with him to Winnipeg. And in 1934, a Meshulach, a tzedakah collector, came to Winnipeg and told him, you won't believe it, I've just been to Los Angeles, I've come from Los Angeles, they're looking for a rabbi there. I think you'd be very good for the job. Well, he didn't wait a moment. He got on the next train, 2-3 days, went to Los Angeles, knocked on the door of the shul, said, I'm here for the proba. Proba means the rabbi who comes to try out. Yeah, what's your name? We weren't expecting you. All right, if you're here anyway, you can do the proba. And he spoke that Shabbos. He was captivating. They hired him. He went back, picked up his family, and he moved in 1935 to Boyle Heights. As the rabbi of Breed Street, he replaced Rabbi Neches, who by this time was busy with the Western Jewish Institute in Fairfax. He replaced him as the senior rabbi of the Orthodox community, the chief rabbi of the Orthodox community in Los Angeles. And unlike Rabbi Neches, he was not into self-promotion and publications and grandstanding. He wasn't into big projects. He wanted simple stuff. He was a rabbi who's concerned about the future of Jewish life. He wanted a day school and he wanted a yeshiva. Those were the two things he wanted. And he opened a day school and a yeshiva, the very first day school and the very first yeshiva in Los Angeles, in his shul. And he hired an incredible scholar who nobody's ever heard of. His name was Rabbi Uri Cherlin, and he was from Dvinsk. He was a Talmud of the Rogachover and of the Or Sameach, and they say about him that he could do the pin test. You know what the pin test is? The pin test, if you stick a needle inside Gemara, and he can tell you which letter in every page that it's gone through. He was an absolute genius, and look at that picture. He was so charming and so lovely, and the boys absolutely adored him. His Talmud Muvik and Rabbi Zilberstein's Talmud Muvik was Rabbi Yonah Gansweig, who later on was in Beverly Fairfax area, had his own shul. Unfortunately, he died young. And this team of Rabbi Zilberstein and Rabbi Cherlin and Rabbi Gansweig, a young Rabbi Gansweig, began to change the course of Orthodox life in Los Angeles through this day school and through this yeshiva. Unfortunately, he became sick in the early 1950s, and in his will he wrote he wants to be buried in Israel. That was quite unusual in the 1950s, and he wasn't buried in Jerusalem. It wasn't easy to be buried on the Mount of Olives in 1954 when he died. You couldn't be, actually. He was buried in Tveria. I spoke this week to Rabbi Zilberstein's daughter, Fegi, and she told me she still goes every year for his yahrzeit to visit the graveside of Rabbi Tzerlin in Tveria. Anyway, but when he became sick, he needed to be replaced. And Rabbi Zilberstein went around the yeshivas on the East Coast to look for a replacement for Rabbi Tzerlin, somebody who could take his role. And he was introduced to Rabbi Simcha Wasserman. And Rabbi Simcha Wasserman came to take the job in Breed Street Shul. But by that time, Boyle Heights was already in quite deep decline. It's the 1950s. And Rabbi Simcha Wasserman didn't smell success. And he went around and he said, I'm not really getting the vibe here in Boyle Heights. And Rabbi Simcha Dolgan said, you're wasting your time there in Boyle Heights. Come to the Beverly Fairfax area. I'll help set you up. And he set up Yeshiva Orel Chonon in Beverly Fairfax, which I saw this picture, this wonderful picture which Barry gave me earlier on. This is 1954 graduating class of Orel Chonon Yeshiva with a very young-looking Rabbi Wasserman, dashing beard there, not the very bushy beard he had much later in life. The thing is, it seems he didn't consult Rabbi Zilberstein before he left. Or maybe he told him he was going, and Rabbi Zilberstein was very offended. And I'll tell you the extent of his offense. In the mid-1970s, which was 20 years later, Rabbi Zilberstein's already passed away. Lakewood sent a kollel, and they opened the kollel in Rabbi Gunsweig's shul, in a back room of Rabbi Gunsweig's shul. And there were absolutely no conditions attached. You can stay as long as you want. We're not going to charge you rent. There's only one condition, Rabbi Gunsweig said. You can't invite Rabbi Simcha Wasserman to give a shir, because he offended my Rebbe. Just to show you the extent of the respect that Rabbi Gunsweig had for Rabbi Zilberstein. No one knew the story, or no one, maybe people knew about it, but it wasn't something which was widely discussed. That's how careful one has to be, even in the pursuit of Torah things and good things. You have to be careful about people's feelings. Rabbi Zilberstein's main role beyond his own community was as the rabbinic authority for kashrus shchita. We're returning to that topic. And he was getting older. And as I said, the kosher meat business was run by unscrupulous people, many of them rabbis. Well, Rabbi Neches' kosher bill had changed things, but still you have to supervise, you have to have a beis din, you have to have sheichtim who's going to check the sheichtim, you have to have somebody who's going to ensure that everything in the butcher shops is 100% in order, that they can't bring in meat from another place. I think we know that story only too well here in Los Angeles. How are we going to do it? Well, step in a man called Rabbi Chaim Uri Etner. Rabbi Chaim Uri Etner is an interesting man. He was born in 1905 in Lizhensk, where his father was a sheichet. And his mother died when he was very young. And in 1936, I spoke extensively to his son, Jacob. In fact, he has a great-granddaughter who is a teacher at Shalhevet. And he was mugged in 1936 in a town called Tarnów in Poland. And during the mugging, there's two thugs beating him up and taking away his money. Two policemen walk past. And one of them says to the other, "Why, we should go and help him." And the other one says, "No, why bother? He's Jewish." And he was so shocked by this, he decided he's leaving Poland. And he obtained a student visa to go to, he was about 30 years old, just over 30, to go to London. And he kept on extending it. And then when he got to the Second World War, he didn't need to extend it anymore. He became a Polish refugee living in London. But he couldn't make money. He tried to open a shul in London's West End. Some of you have read. I'm publishing, slowly but surely, the excerpts of Rabbi Ferber's diary. And Rabbi Ferber mentions this in his memoirs, that this young upstart, Etner, from Poland, who's opened a shul 2 streets away from him and is stealing all his members. Anyway, that didn't seem to succeed. They lived in Ravensdale Road in North London, near Stamford Hill and Tottenham. And eventually, he decided he wants to move to the United States, and he got a visa to New York. He managed to find his father. His father had remarried and had a child, a daughter, and they'd saved themselves. When the Nazis came to Poland, they walked from Poland to Russia and they ended up in Siberia. They survived the war. He brought them to London in 1946, and in 1948 he came to New York. But in New York, there was also saturation. A lot of refugees, a great amount of poverty. And he was looking for an opening. And he came in the early 1950s to Los Angeles, and he introduced himself to Rabbi Zilberstein. And he said to Rabbi Zilberstein, "You're getting older. I've got a lot of expertise in shchita. My father was a sheichet, and I guess they spoke in learning, and he was extremely learned, very charming. And he said to him, I'll open up a Beis Din, and you will be the nominal head, but I will take care of business for you. I'll make sure that the shchita in Los Angeles is 100% in order." And he created the Beis Din. It was reported in the LA Times. It would seem that his plan from the start was to take over shechita, all shechita in Los Angeles, that no other Orthodox rabbi should be allowed to perform or supervise shechita. Everything would have to be under his supervision. That was his intention. And he did create a Beis Din. He had two rabbis, Rabbi Olyansky and Rabbi Friedman, but it seems that they were nominal dayanim, that they were under his thumb. They didn't necessarily go along, they had to go along with what he said. He didn't go along with what they said if they disagreed with him. And he became the law. And he also became friendly with another interesting man who lived here in Los Angeles, Rabbi Judah Glasner, who was the official rabbinic enforcer for the California kosher law. And Rabbi Glasner, who's a few years younger than Rabbi Etner, they became very close friends, and after a couple of years, they began to disqualify shochtim. In 1957, I found a report in the LA Times of complete pandemonium in the kosher meat world because he had banned two shochtim, Rabbi Etner, and he becomes the spokesman. He is the spokesman in this article on behalf of all kosher meat sales. Meanwhile, the butchers are saying there's plenty of other rabbis in town who can supervise us, but he has his firm hand on the shechita here in Los Angeles, which sounds like a good thing. Usually when things sound like a good thing, they're not. And it seems that this 1957 disqualification of shochtim made him lose his monopoly, and other rabbis stepped into the breach, and they began to offer their supervision to wholesalers and retailers who were providing kosher meat for the now expanding Jewish community of Los Angeles, particularly in the West Side and the Valley. The Valley was a growing community. And Rabbi Zilberstein had a son-in-law called David Erlich. And David Erlich had a large chicken poultry wholesale company and the West Coast kosher poultry company. And in 1959, he left Rabbi Etner and he went to another rabbi. The rabbi is never named. A rabbi who he claimed was supervising him. And in January 1960, he got an order from the Beverly Hilton Hotel for an Israel Bonds dinner for 1,120 chicken breasts. And the chicken was delivered on a Saturday. Not good. And Rabbi Glasner came to inspect on Sunday. And he said not only was it absolutely forbidden to deliver chicken on Saturday, but the chicken that was supplied wasn't actually kosher. It comes from a non-kosher supplier. And in his position as the official supervisor of kosher meat for the state of California, he issued criminal proceedings against David Erlich for the supply of non-kosher meat under a kosher label. 383B, you've got it in your hand. Erlich completely denied it. Meanwhile, there was a newspaper, a scurrilous Jewish newspaper called the California Jewish Press. It was run by a fellow called Al Waxman. Some of you remember Waxman, the congressman. This was his uncle. And he was, I'm not sure if he was an anarchist or a communist, or Congressman Waxman told me in a phone interview I did with him that when his uncle died, they discovered that the FBI had been keeping a file on him for the previous 40 years. In any event, in his newspaper, they carried this front page story about the treif meat scandal, and Rabbi Etner obtained 1,000 copies of this newspaper, and he had them distributed to every single shul in Los Angeles and the Valley as people were leaving shul on Shabbat. So there was no way you could avoid getting it in your hand. He then sent a formal letter to Glasner, Rabbi Glasner, requesting that Erlich's chickens be banned for any kosher retailer pending the outcome of the criminal investigation, the prosecution. He also wrote to every butcher to tell them that Erlich's chickens were treif, but it was all to no avail because the criminal proceedings were thrown out of court and Erlich was found innocent. And Rabbi Etner was absolutely furious, and he authored a 9-page document titled Special Edition of Kashrus Bulletin. Remember the Kashrus Bulletin that was published by Neches? He now recreated that. He published this special edition. He sent it to everybody he could think of in Los Angeles. And in the letter, he accused David Erlich, I have to remind you, is Rabbi Zilberstein's son-in-law, of every iniquity that you can imagine. And as a result of which, besides, by the way, for the fact that Erlich is selling treif chickens, you can't imagine what else he's doing. Well, David Erlich didn't take this lying down, and he issued a lawsuit against Rabbi Etner, but not just against Rabbi Etner, against Rabbi Zilberstein, and against Rabbi Oliansky, and against Rabbi Glasner, and against Rabbi Friedman, and against Al Waxman. And this was a massive deal. It was reported in the press, and Erlich's claim, I have to tell you, it was upheld in court, and this part of it was upheld in court, was that the whole thing had been a setup from the beginning, and that someone had organized, he said Rabbi Etner, had organized for the chickens to be delivered on Shabbat, which had triggered the inspection, which had then triggered the result, which was the fact that Rabbi Glasner said that the chickens were treif and were not provided by a kosher wholesaler, which had then resulted in the criminal prosecution, and the whole thing had been motivated to create a monopoly of kosher meat supervision in Los Angeles. I have to tell you, and I'm not going to go through the whole case, because in the end, Rabbi Etner won on a technicality. And he won because the claim was based on infringing David Erlich's constitutional rights, don't ask me how, and also loss of money, and he couldn't prove either that he'd had his constitutional rights infringed, nor that he'd lost any money. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. I think I have a copy here of the final appeal. It was over 7 years. From 1960 to 1967, this case ran. To this day, it's quoted in law books. It's one of the most important cases of slander in California in terms of that slander can only, or libel slander can only be considered a civil problem in a court case if there's been provable loss of money as a result of it. And the Etner-Erlich case is the benchmark case. It went all the way through to the Supreme Court of California. But what the case did manage to achieve, even if Rabbi Etner won it, was that it weakened the kosher law and it totally discredited the position of the state kosher food inspector. It also brought Rabbi Etner's kashrut and supervision standards under very close scrutiny, because as you can imagine, with all the accusations flying in the direction of David Erlich didn't take it lying down, and he began to look into the practices that were employed by Rabbi Etner, and he didn't emerge looking very good. One of the issues was that Rabbi Etner permitted chickens to be scalded before the feathers were plucked. Do you know anything about non-kosher chickens, feather removal? It's a plucking machine. You stick the chicken into the machine, or chickens, and it spins around. It's got things on the side which pluck the chickens out, but the feathers out of the chicken's skin. But in order for that to work, you have to stick the chicken for a few seconds, or however long it is, into scalding hot water, about 140, 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And this relaxes the chicken skin so that the feathers, the mechanical pluckers can actually take the feathers out very easily. You've always wondered, by the way, why kosher chickens are so feathery. Well, that's the reason. It's not because they have a 3-week stubble. They're not in the 9 days. It's not Tisha B'Av. The reason is because they are not stuck in boiling hot water before they're plucked. In any event, we can't do it. And the reason is because it says in Yoredea, 68:10 if you want to look it up, that you're not allowed to cook meat before you soak it and salt it. And if you stick a chicken, even if it's for 30 seconds, into boiling hot water, then it's going to cook somewhat, and then you can't kosher it by soaking it and salting it. Well, that's the opinion of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And he says, what is the measurement of something which is hot enough to be cooked? So according to Moshe Feinstein, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in New York, Yad Soledet Bo, do you know what that is? You have it on Shabbat. If you can stick your hand in water and you don't pull it out immediately, it's comfortable to stay in the water, then that's not considered hot enough to cook anything. And the heat for that is 109 degrees Fahrenheit. So according to Moshe Feinstein, who was the halachic authority for the Orthodox Union, he said, you can't have it more, if you want to do that to the chicken, you can't have it more than 109 degrees Fahrenheit. However, Rabbi Etner didn't believe that was the case. He came out with a whole theory that in California, the chicken skins are thicker, therefore, don't ask me how. I'm serious. The chicken skins are... So when you put them into the hot water for that period of time, it doesn't get hot enough for it to cook, and therefore it's fine to put it at 140 degrees. Well, the OU, the Orthodox Union, came out with a notice to say that Rabbi Etner's chickens are not kosher. I don't know if you have... There's a Jewish version of karma, I think. And he got very angry, and he sued them. And it went to court. It was another court case. And the court case was defended, the OU had itself defended by Rabbi Wein, who flew in from New York, Rabbi Buchspan in those days, who represented the OU here, and Rabbi Shalom Ginsberg was a very prominent witness in that case. And at some point in the case, and I've heard this from a number of people who were there as witnesses, the lawyer for the Orthodox Union said, and what do you say is not Yad Soledet Bo, Rabbi Etner? And he said 140 degrees. Would you be willing to put your hand in 140 degree water? He said, yes. Well, here's some I've just prepared. And he put his hand in the water, and he kept it in there without grimacing for 30 seconds. And then he took it out, and he put it back on the side, and everybody who was there could see that it was red and pulsating, but his face didn't change. He wanted to prove his point. In any event, Rabbi Etner left Los Angeles in 1977. He published a book. He lived in Netanya in Israel. He went on Aliyah. And Rabbi Zilberstein, who had been so terribly affected by this, but he lived, thankfully, to a very ripe old age. He was 85 years old. Do we have that picture of him and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein? Rabbi Moshe Feinstein came to Los Angeles in 1970. A wonderful picture there. There's a Rabbi Schroit behind Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was the rabbi for 40 years at B'nai David. And Rabbi Chaim Baruch Rubin is there on the right. His father is next to him, in between him and Rabbi Katz, Rabbi Shmuel Katz. It's a wonderful picture. And Rabbi Zilberstein at that stage was the senior, very much respected rabbi, not just in Los Angeles, but across the United States and the world. He was so respected for his position, for having stood at the forefront of Orthodox Jewry and halakha and the dignity of Orthodox Jewish life for almost 40 years. He passed away. He's buried here in Los Angeles. And everybody who has memories of him only has the most wonderful things to say. I'm going to turn now to Hasidic Rebbes. Enough with Shrita. I want to talk about Hasidic Rebbes. Who's the first Hasidic Rebbe who came to Los Angeles? Anyone know? Well, you're going to say Rabbi Rottenberg. Everybody always says the same thing. No, you're wrong. The first Hasidic Rebbe who came to Los Angeles was the Nadwana Rebbe from Cleveland. And he came here, Nadwana Rebbe, Rabbi Meir Leifer. He's actually buried here. And he was the grandson of the first Nadwana Rebbe. And the first Nadwana Rebbe, Mordechai Leifer, was born in Satmar in 1881. He lived in Budapest. Meir Leifer was born in Satmar and he lived in Budapest. And he came to Cleveland in 1922. And believe it or not, he made money by selling, bootlegging sacramental wine, which seems to have been very much the business of the rabbinic community around the Great Lakes in those days. When did Prohibition end? 1933, wasn't it? 1933, that's it. In 1934, he moved to New York, and he opened up a Hasidic community in Williamsburg. In fact, he was the first Hasidic Rebbe in Williamsburg. It seems the climate was no good for him in New York. I'm not sure what that means. In any event, he ended up in Los Angeles, where he lived at 357 North Cornwall Street in Boyle Heights, very close to Breed Street Shul. And he died at the age of 60 in 1943, and he's buried in Agudas Achim Cemetery in East LA. There was another Rebbe. You mentioned Rabbi Rottenberg, but his father actually lived in Los Angeles, and he was the Kosher Rebbe of Kleinwardein. And Rabbi Moshe Shmuel Rottenberg was born in 1872. He died in 1946. Kosher is an offshoot of the Zidichoiv Hasidic dynasty, and Rabbi Moshe Shmuel's father, Rabbi Yosef, was the first Kosher Rebbe, and he moved to the United States from Hungary before the war to join his son, who was called Rabbi Avram Pinchas Sholem, who lived in Brooklyn. He lived many years afterwards. He was Rabbi Rottenberg of Los Angeles' brother in Brooklyn. And he couldn't take the weather in New York. He had asthma. It seems a lot of people moved here for health reasons. And he moved to L.A. Also in 1937. He opened a tiny shtibel at 409 North Soto Street. And in 1938, he was joined by his son, Rabbi Ephraim Osher, who many of you may remember. And he had another brother. Rabbi Ephraim had another brother called Rabbi Yidel Rottenberg, who was a sheichet in Los Angeles. And in 1946, Rabbi Moshe Shmuel died, and he was also buried in Agudas Achim. He's a Chassidish Rebbe. So you have two Chassidish Rebbes before you got to Rabbi Rottenberg. And there was a small structure that's built over his grave. You can see it to this day. And Rabbi Ephraim Osher's wife and children were killed in the Holocaust. In 1947, he met Chana Stein Twersky from the Twersky family. She survived the Holocaust with her son David. And her father was the Chernobyl Azarnitzer Rebbe in Bielsk in Bessarabia, it's today Moravia. His name was Baruch Meir Twersky. We do have a picture of him. I think it's coming up later. The Rottenbergs opened a Hasidic shtibel in the Fairfax area in the 1950s, and he died in 1996. He's buried in LA. She died in 2012. She's buried in Israel. But the most famous of all the Hasidic Rebbes in Los Angeles was certainly Rabbi Eliezer Adler, the Zvillar Rebbe, whose Ohel David synagogue only recently closed. Rabbi Adler was a beloved fixture of the Fairfax area for many decades. He was a close friend of Rabbi Zilberstein. I think I have a photograph of him together with Rabbi Zilberstein very early on in the 1940s. And there's another picture of him with Rabbi Yonah Gunsweig, with whom he also maintained a very close relationship. Now, the question is, how did he end up in L.A., and why was he called the Zvillar Rebbe? Because the Zvillar Rebbe was Goldman, not Adler. And he was, by the way, a descendant of the Lelev dynasty. So why was he the Zvillar Rebbe? So Rabbi Adler's family moved in 1851 to Ottoman Palestine. He was born in 1909. He also got smicha from Rabbi Kook, although by that time Rabbi Kook was the chief rabbi of Palestine, no longer the chief rabbi of Jaffa. He was a very significant figure, and particularly because he was friendly with the Zionist movement. In 1933, Rabbi Adler married Batsheva Shapira, who was the granddaughter of Rabbi Shlomka Goldman, the Zvillar Rebbe of Jerusalem, a very special man, a mystic, who in fact came from Russian persecution, came to Jerusalem, and nobody knew who he was, because in those days you couldn't Google someone's photo. And he sat in the corner of a shul for 3 years with no one knowing who he was, until somebody actually came into the shul and recognized him, who was there from Europe, and said, you know that this is the Zvillar Rebbe. And then he became very prominent. And there were a lot of Zvillar Hasidim in America. And Rabbi Adler was sent as an emissary of the Zvillar Rebbe, of Reb Shlomka, to America in 1937 or 38. And he went around to different Zvil communities all over the United States. I know that he was on the Eastern Seaboard, and he was in Denver. In Denver, they offered to open a shul for him. He didn't accept. But when he came to Los Angeles, they said, we're so far away from the center of action. Please, please, will you stay? And will you maintain a Zvil community in Los Angeles? And he agreed, although he made as a condition that he could call the shul Ohel David after the first Lelever Rebbe, Reb David Lelever. And he opened the shul. But by this time, the Second World War had broken out, and he was without his wife and his daughter Miriam. And they were still in Palestine. There's no way they can get across. First of all, they don't have a visa. Second of all, they don't have any money to pay for passage to get to the United States, even though the United States was not yet in the war. Well, one of the big Zvillar Hasidim, believe it or not, in Los Angeles was a man called Harry Maislish. Harry Maislish was the general manager of a radio station called KFWB, which belonged to Warner Brothers. And he was a close friend of Rabbi Adler, and he used to regularly daven at the Zvillar Shul at Ohel David in the Beverly Fairfax area. And in 1943, Vice President Henry Wallace came to Los Angeles and was interviewed on KFWB. And after the interview, he was brought into Harry Maislish's office, and Harry said to him, Vice President, I have a favor to ask of you. I'll give you ad chatzi ha-malchus. What can I ask? What can I offer you? My rabbi's wife and daughter need a visa from Palestine. No problem. He went to Washington. The visa was in the mail. Then they needed money. They needed the money to pay for passage to bring the wife and daughter from Palestine. It was in the middle of the Second World War. It had to be a neutral ship, and passage was extremely expensive. Well, the main donor was Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson's name actually was Goldenberg. He was a Romanian Jewish actor who was very supportive of anti-Nazi causes, particularly because there were those non-Jews in Hollywood who were supporters of Nazi or pro-Nazi causes. He was one of the big supporters of anti-Nazi causes and to help immigrants and refugees from Nazi-controlled Europe. Well, he paid for the passage, and Miriam and her mother, Batsheva, arrived. They came on a Portuguese ship, and they arrived in the United States in Los Angeles in July of 1944. Rabbi Adler had first opened a shtibel in West Adams in 1940. It was the first shul west of Boyle Heights which had a mechitza. I have photos here of Rabbi Adler with his community in the 1940s. Later he moved to Fairfax. He became Rabbi Zilberstein's right-hand man, according to both his son-in-law, Rabbi Hutler, and both of Rabbi Zilberstein's children whom I spoke to. They would speak to each other several times a day, sometimes for hours at a time. So they very much cooperated with each other. And all the rabbi and community leaders in Los Angeles absolutely adored, they loved Rabbi Adler. And here are some photos from his grandson's bar mitzvah provided for me by his grandson, Rabbi Yaakov Horowitz. And sadly, Rabbi Adler's wife died in 2000, and he lived to just shy of his 98th birthday. He died in February 2007. And I would have ended my lecture here, but I have 10 more minutes. And I've just described to you a number of Hasidic Rebbes who lived in Los Angeles, Rabbi Rottenberg, the Nadwana Rebbe, Rabbi Adler, but the truth is it's complete nonsense. They weren't Hasidic Rebbes. Because, what is a Hasidic Rebbe? someone who has Hasidim. In the Chassidische Welt, you don't call them Rebbes, you call them Einiglich. They have a Choshev grandfather, who was a very famous Hasidic Rebbe, and they carry his name and the name of the town, and they can open a shtibel. But Rabbi Adler never had Hasidim. He didn't have people who were, meshameshim, who would do anything he asked of them, who didn't run a court. He didn't have a yeshiva. He didn't go around the world. He didn't travel to different points on the globe, and wherever he went, there were hundreds of people waiting for him at the train station. But there was a Hasidic Rebbe who lived in Los Angeles for almost 40 years. And at one time, he had a very significant following in Poland, thousands of Hasidim. And I want to end tonight by talking about the Yablona Rebbe, who none of you have ever heard of. Rabbi Yecheskel Taub. But I want to tell you what happened to me 2 weeks ago. Because everything you're about to hear is as a result of something that happened 2 weeks ago. About 10 or 15 years ago, I bought a pamphlet. I'm a collector of curiosities, Jewish books. I bought a pamphlet, Hasidim Olu El Ha'oretz. There you go. There's the Yablona Rebbe on the left. The Yablona Rebbe and his farming Hasidim. Any of you here heard of a place called Kfar Hasidim? Kfar Hasidim, it's in the north of Israel. Near Haifa, that's right. Rechasim and Kfar Hasidim. Near the Kishon. Are there any Hasidim there? Yes. No. I've been there. There's no Hasidim there. There's a Litvish yeshiva. There's no Hasidim there. In fact, where the Litvish yeshiva is, Rechasim, which was a refugee camp after 1948, and they attached it to Kfar Hasidim. Kfar Hasidim is Hapoel HaMizrachi, and it is mainly secular Jews living there. Always wondered about that. Look at this picture. What happened to Kfar Hasidim? Well, it was founded as an agricultural settlement in 1924 by two Rebbes, two Hasidic Rebbes, real Hasidic Rebbes from Poland, the Yablona Rebbe and the Koznitzer Rebbe. And the Koznitzer Rebbe was convinced, they were both convinced by a man called Admor HaChalutz, the pioneer Hasidic rabbi, Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira. He was the founder of Hapoel HaMizrachi. You may or may not have heard of him. You will almost certainly have heard of his brother, Reb Clonimus Kalman Shapira, who was the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto. These were Polish Hasidic aristocracy. And Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira, their father, died. His father died when he was very young. He was brought up by his grandfather, who was a very interesting man, because even though he had a following of many thousands, he was a big supporter of the Chovevei Tzion movement, which was before the proto-Zionist movement, before Zionism, and he encouraged Hasidim to settle in Israel. And his grandson, one of his grandchildren, became the Rabbi Piatzesner, the Rebbe, and the other grandson moved to Israel during the Ottoman Turk period and became the Rebbe Chalutz. He came back to Poland. He was a masterful speaker, and he told all the Hasidim, this is never going to work unless we move entire communities from Poland to Palestine. That means not a few Hasidim. The Rebbe has got to go with his Gabba and his Shamus and his wife and his children and his family and his Hasidim and the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. And we've got to open settlements of Hasidim in Israel. And he convinced these two Rebbes, the Yablona Rebbe, who was the Taub family, he was descended from Rabbi Cheskel Taub of Kuzmir. The Mojits Hasidim are Taubs, and it was a very affluent Hasidus. And they moved. The thing is, I heard this story, and I know he moved to Israel, and I could tell that obviously the whole thing failed because there's no Hasidim there, and there's no Yablona Rebbe there. Now, the more you look into it, the more vague the story got. And it seems that sometime in the late 1930s, the Yablona Rebbe disappeared. Disappeared. Completely. And there was a report in 1960 in Haaretz that he had actually moved to Los Angeles, and he'd an assumed name, an alias. His name was George Nickel. And I moved to Los Angeles some years later, and I looked for George Nickel. And I'm good at research. I never found a trace of him. I mentioned him here and there. Somebody said he'd worked with the Kornwasser family. Other people said he occasionally davened at Rabbi Ginsburg's shtibel. Couldn't find a trace of George Nickel. You know, he was feted in the 1920s by the Zionists for moving. This was the Great White Hope. He was moving to the land of Israel, and he was going to bring the ultra-Orthodox community, the Hasidim, to Israel. He was visited by Rav Kook and all the other chief rabbis. There he is, sitting in the middle. That's the Yablona Rebbe. He was visited by Lord Balfour, by Achad Ha'am, Chaim Bialik, Lord Rothschild. Have we got that picture? There's Achad Ha'am sitting there in the middle with the Yablona Rebbe behind him. It says on the picture, it says Yablona Rebbe. And that man standing on the other side with a white beard, that's Lord Rothschild. And the man standing next to Lord Rothschild is Chaim Bialik. It's 1925. This was a sensation. Hasidim are moving to the land of Israel. And I've tried for years to find out more, and I couldn't find out anything. Intriguingly, he's buried in Kfar Hasidim, and we have a picture of his grave. Look what it says there. Ha'admur Yecheskel Taub HaRebbe mi Yablona. And it says somewhere there that he's the Meyased of Kfar Hasidim. Here, there. Yased Nachlas Yaakov Liyomim Kfar Hasidim. I want to tell you something. We have a principle in Judaism, in the Jewish custom. You never write something on a gravestone which is even slightly untrue. And I know that the man wasn't a Yablona Rebbe, for many years. And he wasn't in Kfar Hasidim. How did he end up back in Kfar Hasidim? And he's buried there. And it's a mystery. And I decided 3 or 4 weeks ago that for this lecture, I am going to find out, whatever it takes, I'm going to find out about the Yablona Rebbe. I need to know what happened. I'm going with Eli to Israel, and we're going to the north, to Rosh Hanikran, to Akko, and I'm going to stop on the way past Haifa. I'm going to go to Kfar Hasidim, and I'm going to randomly knock on doors, and I'm going to find out about Yecheskel Taub, George Nickel, Yablona Rebbe, whatever his name was. I want to know about him. I'm not going back to Los Angeles without this information. I'm on the plane, and you know that you have internet now on the plane. Is it a blessing or a curse? I'll leave that to you to decide. And I decided, I had this flash, that every kibbutz and moshav has one meshugana who's the archivist. Do you know that? Oh, it's everyone who's the archivist of that kibbutz, right? I'm sure Kfar Hasidim has a meshugana. It must be, right? So I'm researching online for an hour, 2 hours. You know, the internet's not fast on the plane. And eventually I come up, there's a man who's called Ehud Yonai. He's dead. He died in 2012. And you may or may not have heard of him. Ehud Yonai is very famous in Hollywood because he wrote Top Gun. Thank you. It's very good. He, and then later wrote the history of the Israeli Air Force. He lived in California. There was a magazine called The Californian. And he was one of their main journalists, and he wrote an article in 1983 called Top Guns about the Air Force Base in San Diego, which resulted, the Navy base in San Diego, and it resulted in the movie Top Gun, starring Tom Cruise. Anyway, he moved back to Israel. What should I do with this? And he wrote this book about the Israeli Air Force, and guess where he lives? Kfar Hasidim. And there is a little center dedicated to his memory, run by his wife, Shoshi, in Kfar Hasidim. They also opened an olive farm, and they sell olive oil. And she also does little tours of the area about the Miyastim, the founders of Kfar Hasidim. I email her from the plane, "Dear Shoshi, you're going to think I'm nuts. Have you ever heard of the Yablona Rebbe? Yours sincerely, Pinny." 5 minutes later, I get an email back. Of course I've heard of him. He was my uncle. I write an email back. "Dear Shoshi, see you on Thursday. I'll be there at 2. I was there at 1:30. Let me tell you the story of the Yablona Rebbe. This is the story. It's a remarkable story. The Yablona Rebbe became the Rebbe by accident. His brother-in-law was meant to be the Rebbe. But his brother-in-law died, and then his father died, and he was 24 years old, very charismatic, very charming, and highly intelligent. And he becomes the Rebbe of Yablona, which is like a resort town not far from Warsaw. And Rabbi Shapira comes along, and Rabbi Shapira fires him up. Suddenly he has a purpose in him being a Rebbe. And he calls together all his Hasidim. He says, Moirai v'Rabosai, what are we doing here in Poland? Are we crazy? Mashiach is coming. We've got to move to Israel. We've got to move to Eretz Yisrael. They said, we can't move. Where are we going to go? He said, what are you talking about? We're a wealthy Hasidus. We've got plenty of money. I've got an idea. The wealthy ones are going to fund me to buy land in Palestine from Syrian landowners. And I'm going to go with the poorer members of this Hasidic group, and we're going to build a kfar. We're going to build beautiful homes. We're going to build a dairy farm. And when it's all built, and we'll build your homes, and you'll have your land, and you're going to come, and you're going to join me. And he raised an enormous sum of money, and he bought 30,000 dunams of land in 1924. That's 10,000 acres. A beautiful hill, I saw it. A beautiful hill overlooking the Kishon River and a massive valley in the Jezreel Valley. And he came with hundreds of Hasidim, 200-300 Hasidim in 1924-25. They arrived. And everything that could go wrong went wrong. Malaria, Bedouins killing them, and the Zionist organizations completely lost interest. I mean, it was a lot of fun for propaganda, but they weren't particularly interested in religious Jews being farmers in the north of Israel. And then the Hasidim became angry because they heard about their family members who had malaria and were being killed by Bedouin, and they stopped giving money. And his Hasidim began to starve because there's no social services and there's no money from the government. And they said, we want to go back to Poland. He said, no, you can't go back to Poland. We're going to bring the Yablona Hasidus, we're bringing it to the Holy Land. And he went to the Zionist authorities, to the JNF, and he went to the Jewish agency, and he said, I don't have any money. I've run out of money. I've been back to Poland. There's no money there for me anymore. But I'll tell you what I have got. I've got land. I'll swap land with you for food and for expertise to build a farming community. And they agreed, and they bartered, and they took the land, and they sent him a kvutza, a group of Hapoel HaMizrachi, modern Orthodox, we would call it today, Jewish farmers who trained on Hachshara. They weren't peddlers and schnorrers from Yablona in Poland. And they changed it from a dairy farm to orchards, and they moved it from the top of the mountain to the valley where it is today. And slowly things started to get better until the anti-Semitism in Europe got bad, and the Chassidim started coming from Poland. And they knock on his door, where's our land? Well, I don't have it. What do you mean you don't have it? We paid for it. Where's our land? You promised us beautiful homes in Israel. I don't have the land. I had to give it because the Chassidim were dying. Well, give us our money back. I don't have any money. You're a ganef. Suddenly the Yablona Rebbe, the hero, visited by Rav Kook and Lord Balfour, is a ganef. And his niece, Shoshi, told me that on one occasion, the Chassidim ganged up. He was in the bathroom, and they broke open the bathroom door, and they started hitting him. He had nowhere to go. So he went to America. He had family in America, the Mesrich family in America, in New York, to raise money. He thought, maybe I can raise some money there. I can pay back the Chassidim, the debts that I owe them. His wife went back to Poland. He had no children. And the Second World War broke out. And he heard reports that his entire Chassidus had been wiped out. He can't go back to Poland. He can't go back to Kfar Chassidim. And he's working in New York. And he decides that he can't be religious anymore. And he shaved off his beard, and he cut off his payas, and he took off his yarmulke, and he stopped keeping Shabbos, and he went to open a branch of his family's business in California. And he decided he needs to change his name. And I've got his immigration papers to show you. And this is the first time he signed it with his name. Not George Nickel, my friends. Ronnie, remember I sent you an email? George Nagel. And he went into a self-imposed witness protection program. And he never spoke to anybody who knew him. There were certain individuals in the community who knew him. He had nothing to do with the Jewish community. And his family in Kfar Hasidim were aware of his existence, and they referred to him by a code name, Uncle Dod. Dod is the word for uncle in Hebrew. And they kept in touch with him. He became very wealthy. Because there's one thing he knew from Kfar Hasidim, it was construction. He started buying land in the valley and building cheap homes and selling them. And he slowly built himself up and built more and more homes and became very wealthy. In the late 1960s, he decides, I'm not building cheap homes anymore. I'm going to build an apartment complex. And he built the apartment complex, and it seems, from what I heard from his family here in California, that he was no longer at the top of his game. He was already in his 70s, and he was ripped off by all the subcontractors, and it was very shoddily put together, and he couldn't sell the apartments, and the banks took it away, and he was left with very little. And he was unbelievably upset by this, and he became sick, and he went to hospital, and he almost died. While he's in hospital, he thinks to himself, what am I doing this for? What am I making all this money for? What do I need it for? I want to learn. So he decided to enroll himself at CSUN in Northridge, and he moved into the dormitory. And George Nagel became the celebrity student at CSUN because every single student wanted to have to do with him. There were articles that were written about him. We've got the newspaper report there. This is from 1972, but it was across the United States. In many newspapers, this article about the senior, George Nagel, 77, shares the world of the young, a dorm of Cal State Northridge, now it's called CSUN. And he's a student. He studied psychology, and he graduated with a psychology degree. There's a picture of his graduation. That was his bachelor's degree. He then took a master's. We have the psychology degree certificate as well. He wrote his master's. The thesis was called Paradise Cove. It was more or less autobiographical, and it's fascinating. Ehud Yonai had moved in the 1960s or 70s and kept in touch with him. And Ehud Yonai was at his graduation, 1975, said to him, it's time for you to come home. Enough already, come home. He said, I can't come home, they hate me. He says, no, you can come home. What am I going to do if they hate me? He says, there are enough hotels in Tel Aviv. If you come there and you don't feel comfortable, you go to a hotel in Tel Aviv and you'll fly back to Los Angeles. He says, I need to pass my master's. He passed his master's, and around 1980, he came back. George Nagel, Yecheskel Taub, Yablona Rebbe came back to Kfar Hasidim, not sure what to expect. He comes back, and they have a big party, a celebration, reception for him. And one after another, the pioneers, the original settlers of Kfar Hasidim get up, and they say, Rebbe, you saved our lives. Our families all died in the Holocaust, and you pushed us like crazy to come here, and we hated you. And we wanted to go back to Poland, but you made us stay, and we stayed. And our families all died, and there's nothing left of them. And look at our children and our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. Look what we've set up here. And it's all because of you. Please come home. And he put his yarmulke back on, and he grew back his beard, and he grew back his payas, and he became the Yablona Rebbe. And he died in 1986 and was buried in Kfar Hasidim as one of the miyastim of that Kfar. It's an unbelievable story. It's like a Hollywood story. In Hollywood. So when we talk about Hasidic Rebbes in Hollywood, I'm not talking about the B-listers. I hate to say that. This was an A-list Hasidic Rebbe that you had here in your midst for almost 40 years. And he came back, and there is salvation, there is hope. And nobody's ever seen these pictures before. And nobody knows this story. It's the first time it's being told. And I will leave it here. Thank you.